Chapter 5. We do some printing. One of Ben's chief interests, of course, was printing. I said he wrote so much stuff that the only thing he could do was print it. He felt differently about it, though. He said it was the foundation of his fortune. The dissemination of knowledge was man's highest calling, and so on and so forth. "Consider poor Richard's almanac," Ben would say. "Consider the good that has done for countless thousands. Consider the information." "Oh, you mean that thing that tells when the sun rises and sets? What good is that to anyone? When the sun's up, it's up. Why read about it in a book?" "But," said Ben, "consider the maxims it contains. Think of the lives that have been molded by their wisdom." "Consider them?" I snorted. "Have I ever had time to consider aught else? Here we have maxims for breakfast, dinner, and supper. Have they molded your life? Early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. Bah! When have you ever been to bed early or risen early, except when you had insomnia? Yet you're healthy and wealthy." "Well, perhaps if I lived by the maxim, I should also be wise," he suggested meekly. "That I doubt," said I. "It would require more than a maxim, a miracle, more like." "Then there's also that other horrid one you wrote, 'The cat in gloves catches no mice.' That's a fine idea to be putting into the heads of cats, and you, my friend." "I am sorry about that one, truly I am," said Ben. "It was done before your arrival. I shall delete it in the next edition." "Left to myself," said I, "I'd delete the whole thing." "That," he said, "would be a great mistake, for many thousands are sold each year at no little profit to us, and profits, Amos, buy bread and leisure and cheese." There seemed to be some reason in that, so we let the matter drop. We used to spend a good deal of time at Ben's printing shop, for although he had more or less retired, he still loved to putter about the presses, reading proofs and generally getting in the way. The long afternoons there, while splendid for napping, sometimes were a bit tiresome, so I used to putter about some myself. I stayed well away from the presses, however, having suffered a most painful injury to my tail in one of them. One afternoon, while thus idling about, I came upon type forms for poor Richard's almanac, all set up and ready to print. The first thing to catch my eye was that odious cat in gloves maxim, which Ben, of course, had forgotten to delete. So I deleted it. It was rather fun picking up the letters and dropping them on the floor, so I continued with a few more alterations. Each maxim read, "As poor Richard says," or "Says poor Richard." Now, there never was any real poor Richard. Ben just made 'em up, and I always considered it downright dishonest. So wherever the name occurred, I removed it and substituted Amos. This was not vanity on my part, but utterly a desire for honesty, for there really was an Amos. Besides, it was the only name I could spell. I spent a happy afternoon and had time enough left to make a few corrections in the tide table, where it appeared to be wrong to me, as well as some risings and settings of the moon. I did not bother to tell Ben of these improvements, for he was busy with other concerns. But a week later they were brought to his attention in rather dramatic fashion. In the midst of our after-supper nap came a great rapping at the front door, and the harbor-master came in a state of utmost terror. "Fly, Dr. Franklin, fly for your life!" he shouted. "Calm yourself, friend," said Ben. "Haste makes waste, you know. what appears to be your trouble?" "Trouble?" sputtered the man. "Trouble enough, with the harbor full of ships aground. Do you realize that this thing," waving the almanac under Ben's nose, "predicts high water at 10 o'clock, that 18 ships set sail at 10 o'clock, that every last one of them went high and dry aground at 10 o'clock. Why? Because the tide was low at 10 o'clock. That's why. Do you realize the shipmasters are on their way here now to mob you? Do you realize that the moon you predicted—" "Never mind the moon," interrupted Ben, snatching the almanac and quickly looking through it. He was frowning, and I could hear him mumble. "Amos says Amos. Amos says." We could hear shouts and the tramping feet of the shipmasters outside. 1 or 2 vegetables smashed against the window. The harbor master hid in the closet. But Ben suddenly smiled, and opening the window, calmly stepped out on the balcony. "Friends," he said, "there has been a great mistake." The crowd agreed, with jeers, catcalls, and more vegetables. "But," he went on, "no mistake on poor Richard's part, or mine. For this, my friends," holding up the almanac, "this is no almanac of mine. In the true Poor Richard's almanac there are diverse maxims, adages, proverbs, sayings, and bits of wit and information, all spoke by Poor Richard. If you will but look with care at this scurrilous counterfeit of my almanac, you will find nowhere in it the name of Poor Richard, but only that of one Amos, no doubt a contemptible, ignorant, and inaccurate fellow. No, my friends, this is but a foul hoax perpetrated by an envious rival who hopes to thus discredit the true Poor Richard's almanac. Hereafter, always insist on the genuine and accept no substitutes." There was considerable mumbling and thumbing of almanacs under the torchlight, and 1 or 2 voices could be heard to say, "By gum, he's right. Good old Ben." "Moreover, friends," Ben added, "according to the calculations of the real Poor Richard, whose accuracy has never been questioned, the tide will be high at precisely 3:37 o'clock. I should advise, therefore, that you return to your ships with all haste, for they will all soon be afloat." They hastened off, and Ben saw the trembling harbor master to the door. When he returned, he looked very stern and solemn. "Amos," he said, "Amos, I smell a rat." He may have smelled a rat, but he certainly saw no mouse, for I was well hid under the deepest pile of litter, and there I stayed for 2 days. Chapter 6. Electricity. Ben never thereafter mentioned my little adventure in printing, so I tried to be somewhat more lenient about his maxims. Trying though they were, however, they were nothing compared to an enthusiasm which beset him about this time. This was the study of what he called electricity. It all started with some glass tubes and a book of instructions sent him by a London friend. These tubes he would rub with a piece of silk or fur, thereby producing many strange and to me unpleasant effects. When a tube was sufficiently rubbed, small bits of paper would spring from the table and cling to it, or crackling sparks leap from it to the finger of anyone foolish enough to approach. Ben derived great amusement from rubbing a tube and touching it to the tip of my tail. Thereupon a terrible shock would run through my body Every hair and whisker would stand on end, and a convulsive contraction of all my muscles would throw me several inches in the air. This was bad enough, but my final rebellion did not come until he, in his enthusiasm, used the fur cap to rub the tube, and I was in the cap. "Ben," said I, "this has gone far enough. From now on, kindly omit me from these experiments. To me they seem a perfectly senseless waste of time. But if they amuse you, all right, go ahead with them. Just leave me out." "I fear you are not a person of vision, Amos," said he. "You fail to grasp the worldwide, the epoch-making importance of these experiments. You do not realize the force—" "Oh, don't I?" I replied. "My tail is still tingling." "I shall tear the lightning from the skies," he went on, "and harness it to do the bidding of man." "Personally," said I think the sky's an excellent place for it." Nothing I could say, however, served to dampen Ben's enthusiasm. Soon he received an elaborate machine that could produce much greater currents than the glass tubes. It was worked by a crank which he ground at happily for hours. Our room became filled with rods, wires, tubes, copper plates, and glass jars filled with evil-smelling liquids. It was difficult to move about without touching something that was likely to produce one of those hair-stiffening shocks. Ben even went so far as to organize a group of similarly obsessed people, calling it the Philosophical Society. They gathered once a week, armed with their glass tubes, bits of silk, and wires. They spent whole evenings fiddling with their things or listening to long speeches about the wonders of electricity, mostly by Ben. I napped. After he had played with the new apparatus for a few weeks and had it working well, Ben decided to give an exhibition of his achievements in this field. A large hall had been secured for the occasion by the Philosophical Society. Ben spent several busy days arranging and testing his apparatus, planning various experiments, writing a speech, and inviting prominent people. Frankly, I was bored by the whole affair, but since Ben seemed rather hurt by my attitude, I tried to take a little interest. I read his speech and descriptions of all his various experiments. By noon, I understood everything quite clearly. While we ate a light lunch of bread and cheese, I told Ben of my studies. He was delighted and quite touched by my interest. In the afternoon, he went to have his hair curled, leaving me in the hall, where I went on with my research. Determined that no errors should mar this performance, since it meant so much to Ben, I carefully went over each wire and piece of apparatus, comparing them with his diagram and descriptions. I discovered that he had apparently made several grave mistakes, for not a few of the wires were connected in a manner that seemed to me obviously incorrect. There were so many of these errors to rectify that I was kept quite busy all afternoon. My corrected arrangements seemed to leave several loose wires and copper plates with no place to go, so I just left them in one of the chairs on the stage. I was barely able to finish before Ben arrived from the hairdresser's. As we hurried home for supper, he was so filled with pride and excitement that I had no opportunity to tell him how narrowly he had escaped ruining the exhibition by his carelessness. When we arrived back at the hall in the evening, the brilliantly lit auditorium was crowded. Seated in chairs on the stage were the governor and his lady, the mayor, several of the clergy, and the chief of the volunteer fire brigade holding his silver trumpet. Ben made his speech and performed several simple experiments with the glass tubes. They were watched with great interest by the audience and generously applauded. He then stepped to the new apparatus and signaled to a young apprentice from the print shop who was stationed at the crank. The lad turned with a will, and a loud humming sound came from the whirling wheel, while blue sparks crackled about it. "And now, my friends," said Ben proudly, "when I turn this knob, you shall see, if my calculations are correct, a manifestation of electrical force never before witnessed on this continent." And they did. As Ben turned the knob, the governor rose straight in the air in much the same manner that I used to when Ben applied the spark to my tail. His hair stood out just as my fur did. His second leap was higher, and his hair went even straighter. There was a noticeable odor of burning cloth. On his third rising, the copper plate flew from the chair, landing, unfortunately, in his lady's lap. Her shriek, while slightly muffled by her wig, was nevertheless quite noteworthy. The fire chief, gallantly advancing to their aid, inadvertently touched one of the wires with his silver trumpet. This at once became enveloped in a most unusual blue flame, and gave off a strange clanging sound. Ben leaped towards them, but I clamped on his ear. I had felt those shocks before. "The boy," I hissed, "stop the machine." He sprang at the apprentice, who was still grinding merrily. The lad, not an admirer of the governor, ceased his efforts with some reluctance. The governor was stiff and white in his chair. His lady moaned faintly under her wig. The fire chief stared dazedly at his tarnished trumpet, and the audience was in an uproar. "Never mind, Ben," I consoled him as we walked home. "I feel certain that we will succeed next time." "Succeed? Succeed?" shouted Ben. "Succeed? Why, Amos, don't you realize that I have just made the most successful, the most momentous experiment of the century? I have discovered the effects produced by applying strong electric shocks to human beings." "If you grant the governor is one," I said, "we surely did." The lightning rod. After the electrical exhibition, most of Ben's acquaintances regarded him rather suspiciously. The governor even crossed to the opposite side of the street when we approached. Ben never noticed, though, being wrapped up in more experiments. I observed that he was developing an unseemly interest in lightning. Every time a house or tree was struck, Ben was the first to reach the scene, questioning all who had been present as to how the bolt had looked, smelled, or sounded, what sensations they had felt, and so on. Then he would go into a study that lasted for hours, occasionally murmuring, I wonder. "Wonder what?" I asked finally. It was beginning to get on my nerves. "Why, if lightning and electricity are the same thing." "To me they are," I said promptly. "They're both annoying, horrid, dangerous nuisances that should be left strictly alone." "There you go again, Amos. No vision, no vision." "All right," I said, "all right. And if they are the same, and if you do prove it, then what?" "Why then," he said, "then I shall go down in history as he who tamed the lightning, who—" "If you have any notion of making a house pet of this lightning," I said, "you can go down in history as anything you please. For myself, I will go down in the cellar and stay there." 2 days later, I was waked from my afternoon nap by a terrible clatter overhead. Investigation disclosed Ben seated on the roof, busily hammering. He had fastened a whole collection of sharp-pointed iron rods to various parts of the housetop. There were 2 or 3 on each chimney, and a series of them along the ridgepole. They were all connected by a tangle of wires and rods that ran down through the trapdoor into our room. "You see, Amos," he explained while connecting wires to various instruments, "the trouble with most people is that they lack the calm observation of the trained scientific mind. Time after time I have rushed to the scene of one of those lightning strokes, and all I could gather from the bystanders was that they were terrible scared. Now, by collecting a small amount of this so-called lightning with the rods which you saw on the roof and connecting it through wires to these jars and instruments, we shall be able to investigate its nature and behavior with true scientific calm. We shall be able to forever settle the question that is puzzling all great minds, the question of whether or not lightning is electrical." "It has never puzzled my mind," I said. "Left to myself, I wouldn't give it a thought." "Moreover, you might as well leave out that 'we.' I resigned from those experiments a long time ago. Any observing that I do will be done in the cellar, and as the sky has clouded up rather threateningly, I think I will retire there at once." The storm must have been closer than I thought, for I had barely started for the door when there occurred a most horrifying flash of lightning, followed by a thunderclap that shook the house to its foundations. The shock threw me bodily into a large glass jar, luckily empty. This was really fortunate, for here I was able to observe all that went on, while the glass seemed to protect me from the lightning flashes that followed, one after another in rapid succession. At the first flash, the liquid in Ben's jars disappeared in a great burst of yellowish steam, and the instruments bounced about wildly. As flash followed flash, blue sparks ran up and down the wires. The brass andirons glowed as though dipped in phosphorus, and streaks of fire shot from the candlesticks on the mantelpiece. The crashing thunder was, of course, continuous, jarring every loose object in the house. There was now no doubt in my mind that lightning was electricity in its most horrid and dangerous form. In the confusion, I had forgotten Ben. Now, looking about, I was astonished to find him nowhere in sight. At this moment, a large ball of blue fire emerged from the Franklin stove, rolled across the floor, and descended the stairs, crackling and giving off a strange odor of sulfur. The unusually violent crash that followed brought a faint moan from the bed. There I discovered Ben, or rather his feet, for they were the only part of him visible. The rest was covered up by bedclothes, while 2 pillows completely muffled his head. At first I was alarmed, but as each succeeding crash brought an echoing moan and a violent trembling of the feet, I realized that all that had befallen him was a severe case of fright. Safe in my glass jar, I thoroughly enjoyed the spectacle of Ben's terror as long as the storm raged. As the last rumblings died away, he cautiously lifted up the pillows and peered forth. He was a most amusing sight. "And now, Dr. Franklin," I jeered as he sheepishly rose from the bed, "would you lend a bit of your calm scientific study to getting me out of this jar? And, by the way, what did you observe as to the true nature of lightning?" "Do you know, Amos," he explained, "that first flash knocked off my glasses, and of course I see very poorly without them." "So you replaced them with a couple of pillows," I said. He never answered me. He just started picking up the remains of his apparatus. When, some time later, a scientific writer called them lightning rods, naming Ben as their inventor, he refused to take the credit. This startling display of modesty surprised many people, but not me. I knew all about it.